Welcome back. This is video 2 from module 7, going over process safety management. So again, I'm going to get the screen shared up here with a PowerPoint, and we're going to get it kicked off. Find the right thing to kick it off. All right. Beginning of it. Here we go. We're going to start with F, operating procedures. Now we skipped one because that's process hazard analysis, PHA, and it's pretty big. So we're going to cover that one separately, probably along with compliance audits. So process safety management here, operating procedures, frequently called SOP, standing operating procedures. It's the common abbreviation just about anywhere. I'll move myself down here so I won't interfere. All right. Employers shall develop and implement written operating procedures that provide clear instructions for safely conducting activities involved in each covered process, consistent with the process safety information, which we already covered, and shall address at least the following elements: steps for each operating phase. And these are the operating phases they're called: initial startup, normal operations, temporary operations, emergency shutdown, including conditions under which emergency shutdown is required, and the assignment of shutdown responsibility to qualified operators to ensure the emergency shutdown is executed in a safe and timely manner. Emergency operations, normal shutdown, and startup following a turnaround or after an emergency shutdown. Those things must be covered. Operating limits, again, there's that consequence of deviation again, and steps required to correct or avoid deviation. Safety and health considerations, properties of and hazards presented by the chemicals used in the process. Precautions necessary to prevent exposure, including engineering controls, administrative controls, and personal protective equipment, where we heard that before. Control measures to be taken if physical contact or airborne exposure occurs. Quality control for raw materials and control of hazardous chemical inventory levels, and any special or unique hazards. Safety systems and their functions. Operating procedures shall be readily accessible to employees who work in or maintain a process. Readily accessible. It can't be locked up in some office somewhere. They're going to be out there where they can get to them. The operating procedures shall be reviewed as often as necessary. Notice they don't say exactly when they have to review it, as often as necessary, to assure that they reflect current operating practice, including changes that result from changes in process chemicals, technology, and equipment, and changes to facilities. The employer shall certify annually these operating procedures are current and accurate. So they're reviewed as often as necessary, but they are certified annually. The employer shall develop and implement safe work practices to provide for the control of hazards during operations, such as lockout, tagout, confined space entry, opening process equipment or piping, and control over entrance into a facility by maintenance, contractor, laboratory, or other support personnel. These safe work practices shall apply to employees and contractor employees. You notice what they're doing in here. They're throwing other stuff in here. It's part of OSHA. Lockout, tagout, confined space. They're throwing that in too. So you have to have that too. So that's the end of that. Now, one thing you want to notice about this whole standard, most of these elements are not very big. I'm going to put them on the slides. They're like 6, 7, maybe 8 slides each. They're not very big. And they're just the foundation you have to build on. You have to write your policy to conform to these standards. The element has 3 main paragraphs: initial training, refresher training, and training documentation. Initial training. Each employee presently involved in operating a process and each employee before being involved in operating a newly assigned process shall be trained in an overview of the process and in the operating procedures as specified in paragraph F of this section, which is covered. The training shall include emphasis on the specific safety and health hazards, emergency operations, including shutdown, and safe work practices applicable to the employee's job task. Notice my read just my comments. Each employee, no exceptions. Training shall include emphasis on the specific safety and health hazards, emergency operations, including shutdown, and safe work practices applicable to employees' job tasks. These safe work practices is all encompassing and includes such things as lockout, tagout, hot work, etc. So In lieu of initial training, for those employees already involved in operating process on May 26, 1992, an employee may certify in writing that the employee has required knowledge, skills, and abilities to safely carry out the duties and responsibilities as specified in the operating procedures. You'll probably never need this, but I did once. You should know about it. We had a guy who'd been there for a long time, so he was on board even before all this stuff started. So we had to certify he was trained. I believe he was. He knew more about it than I will ever know. Refresher training. Refresher training shall be provided at least every 3 years and more often if necessary to each employee involved in operating a process to assure that the employee understands and adheres to the current operating procedures of the process. The employer, in consultation with the employees involved in operating the process, shall determine the appropriate frequency of refresher training. Notice what this says, at least every 3 years, and then in consultation with employees shall determine the appropriate frequency. What we did at OK Foods, and it worked out just fine. Every year, each involved employee, we had them fill out a simple questionnaire with a checkbox that 3 years is adequate or inadequate, and if it is inadequate, what they feel that they need to be trained in and how often. We let the employees have input into this because it's very important. And besides, that's what you have to do. You should anyhow. Training documentation. The employer shall ascertain that each employee involved in operating a process has received and understood the training required by this paragraph. Okay, not that they just got it. Here, sign here, you've been trained. No, that you have received it and you understood it. The employer shall prepare a record which contains the identity of the employee, the date of training, and the means used to verify that the employee understood the training. And my notes, received and understood the training. How you do that? Identity of the employee. That's easy. Date of training and means used to verify that the employee understood the training. Suggestion: testing for some training, an acknowledgement sheet signed by the employee and a supervisor. Now, this is identical language is used for contractors in the next section. But so what we did, we had some testing for it, and then we had an acknowledgement sheet that they understood it, and a supervisor had signed it. They talked to the employee and they understood it too. You can think of a better way, then you do it whatever way you think is better. Each employee must have documentation on file. Each employer must have documentation on file for each employee, either a file or a binder, and it's kept out of date. We used to have a binder for each employee. Probably still do, and it worked out just fine. Now, contractors. At OK Foods, we used a lot of contractors. They didn't all have to do with process safety management, but we used a lot of contractors. So I got involved in this with contractors that way, and that was a lot of work for me, which is fine. But this element has 3 main paragraphs: application, employer responsibilities, and contract employer responsibilities. And when you have a contractor, that creates a unique situation in all of OSHA. And we're going to address some of it right here. This paragraph applies to contractors performing maintenance or repair, turnaround, major renovation, or specialty work on or adjacent to a covered process. That's the key here. On a covered process or adjacent to a covered process. It does not apply to contractors providing incidental services which do not influence process safety, such as janitorial work, food and drink services, laundry, delivery, or other key services. Again, the key concepts here: on or adjacent to. On's pretty cut dry if you're working on the system or not. Adjacent to is open to a little bit of interpretation. And it does accept incidental services who might be adjacent to a covered process, but definitely not on it. I mean, just because somebody's sweeping up next to a compressor doesn't mean that's really adjacent to it. The employer, when selecting a contractor, shall obtain and evaluate information regarding the contractor employer's safety performance and programs. Got to make the contractor pony up this in advance. Check their accident info with others in the same NICS. The employer shall inform contract employers of the known potential fire, explosion, or toxic release hazards related to the contractor's work and the process. In other words, you have to tell them what could be dangerous. The employer shall explain to contract employers the applicable provisions of the emergency action plan, which is going to be, we'll talk about later in paragraph N of this section. And they need to know what to do in an emergency. Makes sense. The employer shall develop and implement safe work practices consistent with paragraph F4, which we just covered, to control the entrance, presence, and exit of contract employers and contract employees in covered process areas. Again, paragraph F, which you just talked about, is operating procedures. And paragraph 4 says the employer shall develop and implement safe work practices to provide for the control of hazards during operations, such as lockout, tagout, confined space entry, opening process equipment or piping, and control over entrance into a facility by maintenance, contractor, laboratory, or other support personnel. These safe work practices shall apply to employees and contractor employees. Now, this is something you don't usually see in OSHA's control over entrance into a facility. That's something the OSHA usually doesn't even mess with, but that's something you have to worry about in a process safety management. The employer shall periodically evaluate the performance of contract employers in fulfilling their obligation as specified in paragraph H3, which you haven't got to yet. The employer shall maintain a contract employee injury and illness log related to the contractor's work in process areas. That's an OSHA log we're talking about here. So if you have them, you have to have an OSHA log for them that work there in those areas they're working at. Now, the contract employer's responsibilities, H2, now we're to H3, contract employer responsibilities. Contract employer shall assure that each contract employee is trained in the work practices necessary to safely perform his or her job. How do you know this? If you're the employer and you're bringing this contract, how do you know they have been trained? Well, we asked for training documentation, some samples of it of at least 3 employees to show they were doing it. The contract employer shall assure that each contract employee is instructed in the known potential fire, explosion, or toxic release hazards related to his or her job and process and the applicable provisions of the emergency action plan. This falls on the contract employer, but here's a paragraph from employer responsibilities. So this is the employer. So you get the flow here. The employer shall inform the contract employers, and then the contract employer shall inform his or her employees. So the information goes to the employer, and the contract employer to the contract employees. The contract employer shall document that each contract employee has received and understood the retraining required by this paragraph. The contract employer shall prepare a record which contains the identity of the contract employee, the date of the training, and the means used to verify that the employee understood the training. Again, the employer should require a sampling of this documentation to show that it is being done by the contractor employee. The contract employer shall assure that each contract employee follows the safety rules of this facility, including the safe work practices required by paragraph F4 of this section. There it is again. It says the employer shall develop and implement safe work practices to provide for the control of hazards during operations, such as lockout, tagout, and yada, yada, I'll finish it. But these safe work practices shall apply to employees and contractor employees. The contract employer shall advise the employer of any unique hazards presented by the contract employer's work, or of any hazards found by the contract employer's work. 2 things here: hazards presented by the contract employer's work and hazards found by the contractor employer's work. So if they bring anything hazard, they gotta let you know. If they find something that's hazard, they gotta let you know. The relationship between an employer and a contract employer should be very cooperative, and they should be communicating as much as needs to be done. Their goals should be the same. So you should have good communication with any contract that comes on your site. One more thing, that process pre-startup safety review, weekly called PSSR, 1910.1 section I. The employer shall perform a pre-startup safety review for new facilities and for modified facilities when the modification is significant enough to require a change in the process safety information. Remember, the previous paragraph was entirely about process safety information. So new employees and modified facilities, when the modification requires a change in the process safety information, which is just almost a change in anything. The pre-startup safety review shall confirm that prior to the introduction of highly hazardous chemicals to the process, again, prior to the introduction of highly hazardous chemicals, the next 4 subparagraphs of this one, so they all have to be done. Construction is equipment in accordance with design specifications. Somebody has to be very familiar with this equipment. Construction and equipment is in accordance with design specifications. Safety, operating, maintenance, and emergency procedures are in place and are adequate. That's a big task too. For new facilities, a process hazard analysis has been performed and recommendations have been resolved or implemented before startup. And modified facilities, meet the requirements contained in management of change, paragraph L, which we haven't got to yet. So in other words, for a new facility, you have to do a PHA, a process hazard analysis, which we're going to talk about in the next module, and has to be performed and recommendations resolved. In other words, anything you found wrong got to be fixed or implemented. If it's a modified facility, it meets the requirements of management of change, which we covered in paragraph L. Training of each employee involved in operating process has been completed. That's the last thing you have to be sure. Training is critical in PSM, as it should be in any aspect of an operation. Mechanical integrity, J. Paragraphs J2 through J6 of this section are part of this equipment. Pressure vessels and storage tanks, piping systems, including piping components such as valves, relief and vent systems and devices, so relief valves and relief vent systems we talked about, emergency shutdown systems, controls, including monitoring devices and sensors, alarms, interlock, and pumps. So just about everything that's going to handle your highly hazardous chemical. Written procedures. The employer shall establish and implement written procedures to maintain the ongoing integrity of process equipment. That written is key. Training for process maintenance activities. The employer shall train each employee involved in maintaining the ongoing integrity of process equipment in an overview of that process and its hazards, and in the procedures applicable to the employee's job tasks to assure that the employee can perform the job task in a safe manner. Train employees involved in maintaining the ongoing integrity of the process in an overview of that process and its hazards and the procedures applicable to that employee's job tasks. Inspection and testing. This is huge. Inspections and tests shall be performed on process equipment. Inspection and testing procedures shall follow recognized and generally accepted good engineering practices. There's that ragged gap again. The frequency of inspections and tests of process equipment shall be consistent with applicable manufacturer's recommendations and good engineering practices, and more frequently if determined necessary by prior operating experience. Manufacturer's recommendations must be followed or done more frequently if prior operating experience indicates otherwise. So basically, a manufacturer's information you get when you buy something, that's as good as law, basically, because it's quoted in here. And one of the things we did with our emergency relief valves, there's always concern about they're going to function. So we took 5 of them that were 5 years old, because that was the manufacturer recommended to change them every 5 years. So we took five of them that were 5 years old. We sent them out to be tested, and they all functioned properly. So we were pretty confident that 5-year interval was acceptable. The employer shall document each inspection and test that has been performed on process equipment. The documentation shall identify the date of the inspection or test, the name of the person who performed the inspection or test, the serial number or other identifier of the equipment on which the inspection or test was performed, a description of the inspection or test performed, and the results of the inspection or test. Documentation. If you didn't do it, you didn't document it, you didn't do it. Or you didn't do it, you didn't do it either. Equipment deficiencies. The employer shall correct deficiencies in equipment that are outside acceptable limits, defined by the process safety information, paragraph D of the section, before further use or in a safe and timely manner when necessary means are taken to assure safe operation. Again, correct deficiencies before further use or in a safe and timely manner when necessary means are taken to assure safe operation. Giving you a little bit of it out there, but you have to make sure that necessary means are taken to assure safe operation. So if something goes wrong, you didn't do that. Quality assurance. In the construction of new plants and equipment, the employer shall assure that equipment as it is fabricated is suitable for the process application for which they will be used. Appropriate checks and inspections shall be performed to assure that equipment is installed properly and consistent with design specifications and your manufacturer's instructions. So for new plants and equipment suitable for the process application, checks and inspections installed properly, consistent with design specifications and manufacturer's instructions. The employer shall assure that maintenance materials, spare parts, and equipment are suitable for the process application for which they will be used. Spare parts. What does that mean? How you do that? Well, one of the ways you do that is you buy them from reputable people. You don't try to get the best price on spare parts, or you never go off, out of a regular market for these things. You know, buy them on the black market. That's it for this module. So we'll do one more on this. And thanks for your time. All right.